I'm here because Madhukar is a very, very dear friend of ours at the foundation. Many of you know that I am one of the old veterans of the foundation. Some of you are under the mistaken impression that I am the first employee of the foundation. Let me correct it. The first employee of Azim Premji Foundation is Mr. Madhukar. Sir, Talia. So we go back a long way and have spent some very interesting time during the early days of Azim Premji Foundation. And the PRS is an abbreviation because ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ರೆಕಾರ್ಡ್ ಆಗಕ್ಕೆ ಏನಿಲ್ಲಪ್ಪ. Nothing that I say needs to be recorded. But apparently there is a law and a rule in the country which says no organization can have the word parliamentary in it. Am I right? Therefore they were forced to call it PRS. But a name has nothing, as Shakespeare told us, what's in a name and all that. PRS has been doing some fantastic work and very, very interesting stories. I once travelled with Madhukar from Calcutta to Jamshedpur, I think. And we were together and he told me all the details and interesting stories. So I asked him, so which are the kind of parliamentarians who use research? What would you think? Who would be the kind of parliamentarians who would require research and would be very interested in using research? Take a guess. Huh? Okay, he told me the Amar Singh types. Okay, so very interesting story. But the fact is that for the first time in the country, you got something where parliamentarians had facts, figures and analysis with which to address things and issues rather than gut and rabble. In the US and other places, there is a history and culture of people having research associates with the senators and with the people concerned who are a part of their research body, helping them on an ongoing basis. In India, for the first time, PRS is trying to provide a service like this and reaching out to people. When they do that, they have to be very sensitive, to be seen, to be neutral, because you can never ever be aligned when you do this kind of research. Very interesting. I won't say much more except to say that Madhukar was a fascinating fact. Some time ago, he joined another fascinating organization called the Omidyar Foundation. And P.A. Omidyar many years ago was one of the first guys who brought in return on investment in philanthropy into discussion many years ago. When people are looking at philanthropy as something you hear as charity, etc., Omidyar changed the paradigm there to say, okay, I'm doing charity, I'm doing philanthropy, but what's the bang for the buck? And started getting people to think of philanthropy in a manner that if I'm investing or doing a charity, if that kind of charity does not have an impact, I should have the guts to withdraw from that and go elsewhere and things like that. So that was the kind of paradigm shift. I'm sure that Madhukar is going to help the foundation significantly. But today's talk, given the mahal that we have, cannot be more seductive. How might we evaluate politicians? Over to you, Madhukar, and I'm sure that guys here are going to have a ball.
Thank you, Giri. Thank you, Chandan, for reaching out to me and giving me this opportunity to be here. When Giri says, he's the oldest member of the foundation, it's an honor for sure, but it also goes on to tell you how old I am. So how old we are. So I can include you as well. So it's, although I've been out of the foundation for some time now, I feel deeply connected both with the foundation and the university. So it's a real privilege to be back here. But today, we have other interesting business to discuss, and what I hope we will do, how much time do we have? About an hour? 45 minutes? Is to really look at some of the things that happen in Parliament and ask ourselves the question, do we really know our Parliament? And then of course, if we know, then how do we evaluate our politicians in general? Right? That would be the broad. What I'd prefer is, if there's anything interesting you want to ask, you want to say, jump in, because it makes it more conversational as opposed to a monologue for 45 minutes. So feel free to jump in anytime you want to. This picture is not supposed to be this way, the computer misbehaved, but you've seen the other two pictures. Are you somewhat familiar with those pictures? Do you remember what this was?
Yeah,
the cash for votes scam. This is pretty common, people rushing to the well of the house. It's not very clear, this picture, but this is one more such common sight. This is what we typically see in the media, don't we? And so what we end up having is a bunch of ideas and notions that this is what mostly happens in Parliament. Now, as they say in the media, if a dog bites man, it is not news. If a man bites dog, it is news. Have you heard that? So typically, because this is the exception, it shows up in the news, right? Because rushing into the well of the house doesn't happen as often as the media likes us to believe. That's why it shows up in the media. If it was routine business, it wouldn't show up in the media every day. So that's one thing to just keep in mind as you look at these images, and the nation wants to know answers that we often see on television. So that's some context for us. How educated are our MPs? If I had asked you this question without you looking at this graph, you might have said, I typically ask this actually question somewhat differently. How many people are illiterate in Parliament? Typically I get 30% illiterate, 50% illiterate, all of that kind of number. But the fact really is, 80% of our MPs have college degrees. When I say that, what's your response? Sorry? Wow. Sorry? It's a surprise. You guys are being too gentle. They'd have bought the degrees. That's the response I often get. So then I go on to say, of course, that 50% have master's degrees, postgraduate degrees. Then the response is they've spent even more money. Right? So it's one thing to be cynical, and some degree of healthy cynicism is useful, but we can't get our facts wrong. The fact is that 80% have college degrees. About some small 3-5% have doctoral degrees. Professional degrees, again, plenty of people have professional degrees, engineers, doctors, and other things, lawyers. If you look at the trend line, the less than matriculate, under matriculate, which is less than 10 standard, is actually a minuscule, 3%, maybe 4% of Parliament. Now, 80% college graduates compares with the best, the most advanced democracies in the world. So you should be proud of that. While we have our quarrels with our politicians, this is a fact. All right, this is what's reported. This is what is on paper. If I ask you, for example, which political party MPs have the highest attendance in Parliament? CPI, CPM. Any other guesses? Congress, maybe. So see this party here? Then of course you're right on CPI, CPM. Who's the next? Right? So of course when I show this, mostly people say proxy voting. किसी को भेज के sign कराया होगा. Right? The point is, just for the record, that Samajwadi Party and BSP, if you actually look at session by session, this is as recent as this last session of Parliament, but even as recently as 3 or 4 sessions ago, SP was actually number 1. Which is typically not the sort of images we have about our political parties or their willingness or need to be in Parliament. So again, we have a different impression of our politics, parties, politicians, but the reality is somewhat different. Let's look at another piece of data which you're probably, again there's some bit of a blur there, but in 2001 the salary of the MP was 12,000 rupees. It was raised to 16,000 rupees in 2006. 2010 it went up to 50,000 rupees. Any takers for that salary from graduates from here? Yes, we should go back to 2006 maybe. You have something to say? Such as? They have perks. Yeah? They get free flight tickets. 34 free flight tickets every year.
Is this international flight ticket or?
See? So our images of our politicians really force us to ask those questions. But the point is they get 34 free flight tickets a year. Now that's a lot of tickets. Do you know what MPs use that for? When they come to Delhi for Parliament in any session, every Friday night they go back to the constituency. Every Monday morning they're back in Delhi. That's what they use that for. How about that for a perk? I'll give you one sort of really classic example, this MP from Erode. So the guy would come every weekend back to his constituency. So he would take a flight in the evening, reach in time to take the overnight train from Chennai to Erode, reach Chennai Erode Saturday morning, again take the Sunday night train back to Chennai, take the Monday morning flight to Delhi. That's the 34 free flight tickets. How about that? Any takers? Weekend after weekend. And what do? When they're back in their constituencies, their friends and family? Most MPs, if you've spent any time with any MP or politician really, spends all of their weekends, all of their waking hours on things that you and I would rather not be doing. Just to give you an example, they probably are the people who attend the most weddings and funerals in any given year. I'm not even kidding. They attend the most number of weddings and funerals as compared to any other human being in any given year. They get calls at any hour in the day. People just are completely unrelenting. So it's not, so they have, somebody said, sir, but they have postal allowance. Postal allowance, imagine. When was the last time you wrote a letter to anybody, hard copy? Any of your family? Any? Do you even remember that we had postal letters in our time? Certainly our time we had it. Your time probably you guys didn't even see it. What they use that postal allowance for is to write grievances, letters to government departments. This letter hasn't been done, posted. This hasn't been done, posted. That's what they use it for. So I could actually go down this entire list The only thing I would probably somewhat crib about is this free housing, not because most MPs actually get flats in Delhi, like 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom flats in Delhi. Some of the most senior MPs get these huge bungalows that you've seen in the movies, right? So that's lavish. Do they need those? It's a big question mark. But by and large, even that the Lutyens' bungalows are, I would say, maybe 10% MPs, 15-20% MPs. The other 80% MPs have flats that we normally live in, people like us live in. How do our friends from Karnataka fare? If you actually do a state-wise comparison, I just brought 3 states up here in the national average. The blue, the first, is Karnataka. So the national average for debates in the 15th Lok Sabha is 36 debates per MP. Karnataka is half of that. Our MPs don't open their mouths in parliament. The typical notion happens to be that, progressive state, educated MPs, so they must be talking a lot. Look at the numbers. Again, look at UP and Bihar, and look at the national average and look at where we are. So our MPs cannot even represent us in parliament. That's one of the jobs, I would think. And to represent us in parliament, you have to say something in parliament. But if you feel underconfident or underprepared, or you have nothing to say, whatever the case may be, you're doing a poor job of it. Just again, interesting data for you. If you look at the top 10 MPs in terms of debates, how many times do you see Karnataka? There's one southern state, which is Tamil Nadu. That's it. Actually, if I put data out on just the 4 southern states, Karnataka, Andhra, Kerala and Tamil Nadu, Karnataka would be the lowest in all parameters compared to those 4 states. Including education levels, by the way. Karnataka MPs have lower education levels than the national average. Karnataka MPs have definitely lower education than all the southern states combined. So question mark for us is, who are we really electing? Why are we electing them? Do we know what they're doing or not doing when they go to parliament? Or are they just showing up placards when there's a Kaveri issue? Is that their participation in parliament? Is that what we expect from them? Big question marks. So, what does a typical voter ask? Elections are coming up, right? 6-7 months from now, we have general elections coming up. What do we ask of our MPs? Typically, these are the kinds of questions that come up. No? Do we ask anything different? Kinds of? Such as? Such as?
We ask that they don't take bribes.
Yeah, that's a good one.
We ask that they deliver what they promise.
Do you know what they promised?
Yeah, they make it loud and clear during the election.
During the election, but have you followed what they promised 5 years ago and then have you tracked it? We don't track it.
Scientifically, no, but it's glaringly obvious when you look at
But because we look at these things, have you fixed my street, for example?
not something.
Such as?
The garbage overflowing.
Garbage. Yeah, fix my street is, it's a metaphor really for all the civic things that we care about, right? So actually, one of the things that happened in the 2009 election, I was seeing this on TV, this first time MP came, by the way, just for statistics, we had 309 first time MPs in parliament in this election, in the last 2009 election, 309 out of 545. That's almost 60%. So one of the enthusiastic first time MPs was attending parliament for the first day, and you had all the news channels lined up to ask all kinds of questions. And so the CNN IBN guy stuck a mic in somebody's face and said, "You're a first-time MP, congratulations, thank you, thank you. So what do you really want to do in Parliament? Why have you come to Parliament?" This guy very enthusiastically responds, "I really want to serve my constituency." So the CNN IBN guy looks at the back into the camera and says, "For that you really need to be a municipal councillor." Right? The point is just to sort of hit home this idea that the MP is responsible for garbage, or for fixing my streets, or for fixing, getting a job, or for any of this. We've forgotten our 10th standard civics, basically. Maybe we didn't even learn that in 10th standard civics. The understanding of what we want from an elected representative, whether it's a councillor or an MLA or an MP, in our minds, generally speaking, there's not much of a difference. We ask all of these guys the same kinds of questions. So it comes back to us. Somebody said, who needs the work of PRS? Somebody said the Lalu types. What do you mean by the Lalu types? We are the Lalu types. No? Our knowledge of what our MP should do, we don't know, and we blame them.
Can we really blame the voter for asking such questions? Like it feels that representation at the highest level is the MP, apart from the MLA.
So let's parse it out a little bit. 2 or 3 important points. First, as a general observation, our understanding of basic civics in India is pretty much non-existent. That's a fact. Let's all acknowledge that. Had I not been in PRS, if you had asked me the same question, I would have given you the same answer. It's just happenstance that I went to PRS, set it up and did this for some years. I've thought about these things. Otherwise, I would have answered exactly the same way that you did. So our civic awareness is completely non-existent by and large. And second, our public institutions, our media, does very little to educate us on the actual facts. If you look at our textbooks, if you look at the discourse on the newspapers, the TV channels, you really don't get an education at all on any of this stuff. And then we stand in judgment of those guys, the Lalu types, as somebody said. The problem is we don't know what to expect of our MPs, we don't know what their roles are, just for the fact, just to, if you look for the definition of what is the role of an MP, is it written up anywhere? Constitution? No. No, but nothing clear. And certainly it says you have to legislate. But really, is that the only function? So you actually have to dig deeper, look at other countries, look at other democracies, look at our own democracy, and then figure out in some ways what the real role is. Fine, you figured it out. Have you been able to articulate it in a manner that all of us can understand? Nobody does it. We've actually given notes to Parliament as PRS to say, look, here is a description of how they've used in the UK. Here are the functions described for an MP. Of course, UK doesn't have a constitution. This is how they've developed it. Maybe we can use our own definition for what an MP should be doing. And Parliament hasn't acted upon it for some years now. It's an ongoing discussion that we have with Parliament. That doesn't happen. So all of us are to blame collectively. But the problem is we all remain ignorant in the process. So when we talk of elected officials and evaluating elected officials, I wanted to draw one distinction, which is somewhat important. We have the executive and we have the legislative. What's the executive? The bureaucracy and cabinet. Yeah. So of all the MLAs or of all the MPs who get elected, some of them go to form the cabinet, right? The prime minister, cabinet of ministers, they are the political executive, and then there's a bureaucracy to support the political executive to discharge all the responsibilities, such as fixing roads, such as getting jobs, such as creating jobs, such as making sure licenses are given away without corruption, all of those things, right? That's the job of the political executive. The bureaucracy is there to support the political executive. That's how it is set up. All the other people, all the other MPs who get elected or the other MLAs who get elected in states form part of the legislature, which is called the legislative, right? Which is very different from the bureaucracy. Irrespective of which party they are not part of the executive. So you might be an MP from Congress, but you're not part of the cabinet, you're part of the legislative. Now this distinction is very important because you want to evaluate these individuals, then you have to know what their roles are. If you're in an executive position, let's say you're the Minister for Water Resources or Agriculture or Education, you can certainly ask the question, what was the situation when you started as Education Minister, on whatever parameters we might decide to look at, and then say, look, you've been Education Minister for 3 or 5 years, what progress have you made on those indicators? That's the job of the Education Minister, and therefore whichever bureaucracy was supporting him, they are all accountable for that set of results. The Prime Minister is responsible for everything, right? Including some of the portfolios he holds, right? So that's the executive. But what about the legislature? Legislature is much more diffuse. They don't have any executive power, at least on paper, right? They can't, issue licenses. They can't, issue executive orders to do certain things. They can't make sure that monies reach on time for a certain project. They're not following through the work of a project on a day-to-day basis. So what is their role? How do you evaluate them? So generally speaking, in a Westminster democracy like we have, broadly there are 4 roles of MPs, right? The first role clearly is lawmaking. That's why they're called lawmakers, right? Parliament, in our system, the executive introduces the bills or ordinances, as we've come to see more and more, and it goes into Parliament, gets introduced. Then the Parliament examines the contents of the bill, debates, changes whatever it decides it should change, and then votes on it. Did any of you see the food security bill being debated in Parliament? No? I'm sorry? That debate in Parliament ran for many hours. The voting took 3 hours for it to be passed. The voting, it was voted clause by clause and it took 3 hours. Lokpal, did any of you watch the debate? Land acquisition, right to education. These are landmark, really game-changing bills of our times. These have implications for us, for our children and their children. And which is why I said in the very beginning, the exception really is that there's so much noise in Parliament. By and large, if you see these debates actually, not all debates are of the same quality, but you will see a lot of fine debates on the floor of Parliament. Outstanding debates on content, on just the flair with which they make these, arguments. It will beat all of us hollow, and there's no question, right? And the way they build their arguments over 45 minutes, for example, mixing the fact, the political rhetoric, the argumentation, it's just outstanding. If you haven't watched it, I would urge you to look at some recordings of these outstanding debates. It's massive learning for all of us. It'll actually, for if we have any misgivings about the capabilities of our politicians, it'll just throw us to dust. I mean, just absolutely watch it, please. Clearly, not all debates are of the same quality, right? And so one of the things, I have in my previous work in PRS, before I set it up, I had not worked with politicians in my life. So obviously I had my own notions about what politicians would be, what they would do, but certainly I've had a lot of opportunity to learn a lot about them. Who comes to PRS to ask for information? Why do they come? What's their incentive? So I'll come to that in a minute, but the point I wanted to make is the role of the MP is this, and then you say, look, how do you evaluate whether the institution of Parliament is functioning, and therefore within that, or how is the role of the MP itself evolving? Just show you some data, and I'll come back to the stories that I could sort of tell you. So if you look at the historical sort of trend of Parliament and how it's been sort of functioning, we used to have as many as, this is Rajya Sabha, Lok Sabha used to be 140, we've had 150 days of Lok Sabha in the early years. You can see the trend line, right? We're down to on average of 65, maybe 70 if you're lucky. This was the lowest, 2008 was 46 days. That year was a particularly bad year for Parliament for one reason, I don't know if you recall. That year was the year when the nuclear liability, so the Indo-US nuclear deal was being debated. We had a no confidence motion, and there's a rule in Parliament which says you can't have two no confidence motions on substantively the same issue in the same session of Parliament. Okay, so the no confidence motion came up in the monsoon session of Parliament. The government scraped through. Now typically there is a winter session of Parliament. If there is a winter session, the opposition, it was feared that they would bring in another no confidence motion. So what did the government do? It shrunk the number of days of Parliament, and in the dead of winter, they didn't call it the winter session of Parliament, they called it the extended monsoon session of Parliament. Because of the technicality, they didn't want another no confidence motion to be sort of pulled up against them. It was called the extended monsoon session of Parliament. So that was the worst. But the trend is clearly seen, and we are somewhat hanging around for the last few years in the 65 days or so. In Karnataka, just for the record, I think it was 2005 we passed an act in the state assembly saying that we would meet at least for 60 days in a year as the house, right? Since then, it's now 2013, there hasn't been a single year where we met for 60 days. Not a single year. So that's so much for the laws that we pass. Productive hours, we've been seeing a lot of disruptions in Parliament. So this very faint line, I don't know if you can see it at the back, is the percentage of hours lost. This is the percentage of hours lost. It has gone up. It's 80%. That was close to 100%, I guess, in one of the sessions. So we've lost a lot of time, and so that's a sad trend. Especially it's been accentuated in the last few years. Something we need to fix. So I'm just giving some data on the institution of Parliament before we look at evaluating individual MPs. Younger MPs, what do younger MPs do? Are they active, not active? Under 50 is what we've counted as younger, just for the record, just for this graph, right? That's 29% of all MPs are under 50, right? Questions, younger MPs have asked more questions, but if you look at debates or if you look at attendance, younger MPs attend less as compared to the older counterparts. Similarly, on debates, the older MPs, somewhat more senior MPs get to debate a lot more than some of the younger MPs. That's not very encouraging. If we thought that our younger MPs would come and save us in some way. Bills passed, this is not a particular comment on the functioning of Parliament in some ways, because if you didn't need to transact too many sort of pieces of legislation, you've passed all the laws you wanted to pass in the past, so you don't need to pass, then it's okay. But I think this decline has, especially in the last few years that we've been tracking, has a larger story to tell, which is every session of Parliament, we produce something called vital stats and plan versus performance. How many bills did you plan to pass? How many did you actually pass? So it reflects several things.
So that spike there is the emergency spike.
Yeah, they were like, day after day, you pass many bills, right? Absolutely, right. So that's an important point. So the emergency was,
You should show it in red with some skull mark or something. That was the worst period.
Clearly was.
Don't get me started.
Right. So, just for context again, so all these bills come in Parliament. We have the Right to Education Bill one day. We have the Civil Nuclear Liability Bill the next day. We have the Reserve Bank Amendment Bill the third day. We have a discussion on floods in Bihar the fourth day. We have discussions on Naxal attacks in Chhattisgarh the fifth day. How many of us in this room or pretty much anywhere on the face of this earth can be fully prepared on our own on all of these different issues on a day-to-day basis? How many of us can? No matter how intelligent we are, no matter how hardworking we are, it's just humanly impossible. As one of our MPs actually said, it's one thing to understand, it is another thing to prepare enough to say something in Parliament in front of 500 of your colleagues, many of whom are waiting to see how they can pull you down. Right? So when you go on the floor of Parliament and you want to make something say something substantive, you better be really prepared. So what do we have for them to go prepared? What do we have for them? If you look at the US, just as an example that I can easily cite, the congressman has about $800,000 every year given to him or her so that he can hire staff. Typically about 15, 16 people work as staff. Plenty of interns work with Congress people. Senators have about 30 staff plus interns to prepare them on a day-to-day basis for whatever happens in Congress or the Senate. Our MPs have zero research staff. Zero. No research staff. So our MPs are expected to be sort of superhuman beings who know all of it, who can sort of comprehend, analyze, internalize, and go speak on any issue under the sun. Big problem. They don't have formal office space in Delhi. They work out of their homes. Right? So instead of those Lutyens, bungalows, if some of those had been converted to MPs' offices, that might have been better use of space. Right? Most political parties don't have strong internal research capacities. They have capacities, for example, in especially the larger parties and even the smaller parties. the kind of research for rebutting what the opposition says, right? But on substantive issues, even the large political parties don't have structured ways of looking at issues. There might be a bright lawyer or senior politician who has his own staff who looks at stuff and prepares him because he has the money to afford those staff. But there is a party have it, the party doesn't have it by and large. The exception is generally the CPM and the CPI who lean into JNU, for example, and and the professors in JNU to help understand issues. Of course, they have an ideological focus, and so does JNU. And so there's a good marriage in some sense, which is a good thing. I'm glad at least some MPs and some political parties are reaching out to academics to understand issues. I wish more people would, from Karnataka, for example, reach out to Azim Premji University and ask you guys, this issue is coming up, the right to education, what should we say? What do you think? What are the issues? Right? So it doesn't happen very often. I wish some of our MPs did. So this sort of context, when you look at MPs and how you think of evaluating, the point I wanted to make was, first of all, let's understand their roles. If you don't understand the role, you can't evaluate. Once you have the role, let's get the institutional context in which they operate, right? And then look at what support they have, how equipped are they to actually deliver on those roles before we start evaluating them and standing in judgment. You had a question, Pradeep?
So, that the MPs who are in power, who are in, like Congress MPs, who are the ministers, they have a bureaucratic support. So they used to use them for research as a research staff. So we can make a distribution between the MPs who are in ruling government and who are in not.
So important point to make, just want to re-emphasize for clarity, it's not ruling party and not ruling party. It is executive and legislative. All of this after the first slide on the executive that I talked about is focused on legislators, MPs who are not part of the cabinet. Even if you're from the ruling party and are not part of the cabinet, you don't have any support. You don't have IS officers, working for you. Only the ministers and people in the executive have IS officers and other bureaucrats working for them to implement the policies of the government. Very important distinction, but MPs don't have it, irrespective of which party you're in, unless you're in the executive. Ma'am.
I have two questions.
Yes.
One is the MP who is during election making grand promises, is he unaware that he is not the one who's going to execute that? One. And second, this implementing body is only implementing and not empowered to take decisions. To whom is this implementing body answering? Do you have any comments?
When you say implementing body, you're talking the bureaucracy, ma'am?
Yeah.
So our structure is such that, to your first question, most MPs are aware that they don't have the authority, formal authority to execute on any of the promises they make. Unless they have the odd chance of becoming the minister for whatever it is that they want to be making promises for. If you're promising railway bridges, and if you happen to become the one railway minister in the country, maybe you can execute, but by and large, so most of the time, they'll say, I'll get you a railway platform, right? Or I'll put a bridge across this, or, I'll put up excellent roads. They know they don't have the authority. They know it. Especially if they have been MLAs in the past, they absolutely know it. But they still make those promises because we don't know. It's not a comment on any one of us, really, as much as all of us. They can make those promises and get away because we don't know. If the person comes and says, I'll make sure you get roads, boss, you don't have the authority to do it. It's the municipal councillor's job. It's the mayor's job. It's the corporation's job. If we actually confront the fellow, potentially he would probably hold back and say, oh my God, my electorate is informed. But none of us is informed. And therefore he'll come and make all these grand promises of which we of course don't keep track of, right? Maybe anecdotally we might remember a thing or two, the guy said this 5 years ago, but really he would have made 100 promises perhaps, and we don't keep track of it, and certainly not our job to keep track of it as citizens, but somebody has to do it. Certainly, we all, that's the point I was trying to make. Our civics education is so poor, generally speaking, that the guy can say anything and we don't know what he's saying or not saying, and whether it's even true or possible. To your first question. Second question, on the, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the second question.
Yeah, you said that there is a decision-making body and there is an implementing.
Yeah, right. So laws are passed by Parliament. For example, the Right to Education Act is passed by Parliament, but the implementing responsibility is with the Cabinet and the Education Minister and the Prime Minister. So the job of the Parliament is to oversee. So the way it's structured is, look, we Parliament have empowered you government to implement the Right to Education Act. Our job therefore is to do 2 or 3 things. One, first of all, empower you to do it. Second, allocate the budgets, which is what the whole union budget is about. Supposed to be, at least on paper, Parliament providing approval to the government on where it can spend the money and where it cannot spend the money. That's how it's supposed to be. The third responsibility of Parliament at the legislative side is to oversee how the government is functioning. So I've given you this power to implement the right to education, I've given you the money. Are you implementing that in the way you said you would, or are you not implementing that? That's the responsibility of Parliament. Oversight is an important function of Parliament. Now we all know whether it happens, how well it happens, are we all satisfied with that? Big questions. But the problem is, goes back 3 levels, we don't even know that it's the job of the legislators to actually oversee the government's implementation of programs. If you don't know that, we won't ask that. So you have a question.
How useful will a shadow cabinet of the kind that England follows be?
It will be useful in my view. At the very least, if there's a structured way of tracking what the government promises, and then keeps putting out, even for political, with a political motive, right? I think there will be huge value. The problem in our country, as I've come to observe, is that once the party loses power, they become so fragmented and disorganized, because if you want to run a shadow cabinet, you really have to be organized. You have to delineate responsibilities, put the money that's required to do the analysis that's required to actually hold the government responsible. Unfortunately, none of our parties seem to be capable of doing it for whatever reason. So if the political class is not doing it, in some ways, we've been seeing on television that you scratch my back, I scratch yours, we're all friends, behind the television cameras, and that's a good thing, by the way, to be talking to each other across parties. But that shouldn't mean that we condone the things you do, or will overlook the things you might not do. So that's where the role of universities comes in as an example. What can, for example, Azim Premji University do to track the implementation of the Right to Education Act across the country? Right? Does it have a responsibility? Does it have an opportunity to do it? Will it make a big difference whether Azim Premji University tracks this on a sustained basis and puts the pressure on the government? Question to ask. JNU in Delhi University. Many of these world-class institutions, in my view, can become even more world-class if they're at the cutting edge of contemporary discussions that are going on. I'm not saying you shouldn't look at all the other stuff that the university should look at, but in the absence of a lot of other institutional mechanisms that should be working, who else will step in? It's us. We don't step in. We are all sort of complicit in some way that things are not happening the way they should. So, sorry, I probably didn't fully answer your question. So the structure really is that the legislative should oversee the executive, and the cabinet should oversee the bureaucrats to implement everything. Now, whether all of that happens is a big question. So you had a question. Yeah.
Isn't there a provision of constituency-wise and MP-wise fund allocation? Basis that they make promises. Am I wrong?
So, yeah, absolutely. So it's a very important point as well. So, the MP lads and MLA lads funds, were being referred to. There's a huge issue in having MP lads funds, because there's something called separation of powers in our constitution, which is supposedly separating the executive and the legislative. And what the MP lads funds does is precisely break that, creates conflicts of interest, and vitiates a lot of things. So we've had court cases on that, and courts have carefully sidestepped without making a ruling one way or the other. That's another story. But the amount of money that an MP gets is 5 crore a year. And over a 5-year tenure, it's 25 crore. It's a lot of money. It used to be 2 crore until recently it went up to 5 crore. MLA gets about 1 crore a year. It's about 5 crore. If you make a list of the promises the MP or MLA makes, it's just way in excess of those numbers by and large. Some may not make those promises, but by and large, MPs and MLAs make. But the larger point is, do we know, anyone in this room, what the size of the union budget is? Union budget last year? Any idea? If you divide that by 545 constituencies, Lok Sabha constituencies, do you know how many thousands of crores that will be per constituency on average? It's not everything that, not all the money comes to the constituency, but on average. Do you know how much the Karnataka government budget was in the last year? 1 lakh crore. It came up in the newspapers, didn't it? Yeah. If you divide that over the number of constituencies, how many do we have in MLA constituencies in Karnataka? 224. Do you know how many 1 lakh crore divided by 224 comes to? So the money that the MP gets under the MP lads is so minuscule compared to the kinds of things that need to get done in a constituency. It's just almost completely irrelevant in a real sense. But what it does is it gives the MP to play around with a promise here, community hall there, minor stuff like that, to please his constituents from time to time. But MP lads is a bad idea. In principle and in concept, it's just a very bad idea. Back to sir.
In the previous slide, I was thinking, but do you see a change in that trend? That is, when we're talking about the research staff not being there, because many of the MPs have started recruiting their own staff. And the other thing which has been also being tried out by many MPs is the NGO. They all float an NGO where all these research expenses are going. So is that a growing trend?
It is a growing trend, and it's a happy trend in some ways. The only downside to that is it's unfortunate that MPs have to become innovative about how they get this done, as opposed to the institution of parliament in some way empowering those guys to say, look, whatever you're doing is important for parliament and your work in parliament, therefore we should support you. That would have been the ideal thing. But in the absence of the ideal, I think a lot of MPs are trying to find ways of becoming more sort of informed, and therefore be better engaged on issues that matter. That's true.
In that the younger ones are more active than the older ones?
I think those who have the ability to sort of use their personal money are better off, young or old. Some, despite all of the things we see in the media, some actually don't have the means to do it. But several MPs are using their personal resources to actually get it done.
You have some qualitative data about 1950s and 60s when
Um, I can give you now, and it was roughly the same. It wasn't even this organized. MPs right now, when they go and ask the Parliament Library, this bill is coming up, can you give me some information on this? What they get is photocopies of newspaper articles on that subject, right? So, as PRS, we've always said you can't base national policy on newspaper reports. It's pretty bizarre. That's what they get. Now, I would think in the 50s or 60s again, they weren't any better off, than what our MPs are today. It's also a bit of a myth to say those good old days we had these fantastic debates, because in those days newspapers used to cover a lot of the debates in detail. They'd spend two pages of any major newspaper would have what happened in Parliament, what somebody said, what somebody didn't say. Today, newspapers don't give the time of day for this kind of stuff. So we don't know what grand debates are happening. That's why I asked this question. On the 4 or 5 landmark game-changing bills, how many of us in this room saw 10 minutes of the debate? Probably none. So we don't even have a yardstick, because we've seen the work much more closely of Parliament. It's not we've read debates in the past, they had good debates then, they have good debates now, right? It's very hard to then benchmark and say those debates are better in some way, or it's very, very hard to sort of make that comparison. Back then. So, for some reason this graph is not showing up, but I had a very interesting, I had pulled out 3 or 4 bills which showed civil society participation in the lawmaking process. Most bills in Parliament are referred to something called the Standing Committee. A Standing Committee has about 31 members of Parliament from across parties. And when a bill goes to Standing Committee, the Standing Committee invites suggestions from citizens. In the Lokpal bill, they had 216 submissions, 216, from different people across the country. On the Food Security bill, they had 1,000 plus suggestions, right? From people like us, writing and saying, this is what I want this bill to look like. So there is a mechanism for people to write and say what they want. What the parliamentary committee does is it sifts through all of these responses and say, by the way, this is a new perspective which we would like to hear. And then they call such people, obviously a small number of those people, to come and testify in person. So you could potentially be called to Parliament, say, if you had something interesting to say, to go and make a presentation to the committee and say, by the way, I think the Right to Education Bill should have 1, 2, 3 and 4 clauses because, or whatever. Now it's up to the committee to decide whether to use any of your sort of, suggestions or not. But often in a lot of the committee reports that we've seen, parliamentary standing committees take public feedback pretty seriously. Whatever they finally think is of value gets into the standing committee report as an observation and sometimes a recommendation. So there is an opportunity. I mean, obviously you're not a member of parliament, you're not the executive, therefore there are limitations as to how much you can get in, but certainly there is that. Maybe if we all fast for 100 days, we might also be invited. I'm not even sure. But yes, I mean, the government finds different ways of consulting people. That was an extreme case. Clearly an extreme case. Yeah, that's an extreme case. That's highly unusual, that citizens sit with the government and then draft the law. That's correct. That is correct. Excellent point. I did not touch upon the political economy question because it's extremely complicated. I mean, it will take me a much longer time to discuss it. Are we out of time? Are we sort of going on? So Q&A? We have 10 more minutes? Okay. About 400 MPs reach out to PRS for all kinds of inputs on legislation and other debates that come up in Parliament. And we've had very structured briefings to political parties. We've had plenty of one-on-one briefings to MPs. And sometimes they sit us down for 2 hours or 2.5 hours to intricate, complex political economy sort of thing going on. And at the other, I'll give you another anecdote, but happens many times. We've had MPs who we've briefed, and they've gone and spoken something in Parliament. And in some cases, the opposition guys have come and said, "Aaj aapne bahut acha baat kiya Parliament," right? And this guy would come out and call us and say, "Sir, आपको पता है opposition वाले आके हमको बताएं कि I spoke well." It's childlike at one end, right? Very childlike. This is like all of us would react. This is my sworn enemy. He came and said I did a good job. It's a very sort of, you have this entire spectrum coexisting, and that's what makes it interesting and complex. But we could have a much longer discussion on the political economy, sort of, much of it I can't say on the record. So, yes.
I was just wondering, I was just waiting to discuss some of the words like what you do in PRS. You guys have brought like on last time. If you just go into more detail, what sort of data you provide, what's the form of the data, conversations, drafts, research papers, more importantly, how fulfilling these are, and instead of emerging culture at all of having a research staff of their own, there's no culture right now, but it's still wanting to learn. And yeah, like anything more about the this, and maybe how you guys started, even from the individual and you start those parliament, some parliamentary bodies.
This could be a whole new discussion. I will somewhat answer that, but can I take 2 more questions and close it with those 2 more questions, so we know there's some end.
When we are talking about MP local area development fund, you told outright that it's not worth or it's not viable. Now the thing is, when we are focused on MP and when we take the case of district legislature, then people who are aware of policies, how they are estimated, they even forget chief minister exists, where at district level these policies are implemented. And MP being a legislature, he has command over his constituency, which may cover more than what district or certain part of. Now the thing is, if you are again arguing about the salary, which is only 50%, then at the government level the highest salary may be 80,000. So this thing, like even if you argue that chief minister being an MLA also has complete power over his or her country. So having discussions based on this notion that MPs are not researching or whatever, but they have a whole lot of resources under them. So how can you say that having some people who just like in corporate sector, they will have some research based work and will bring about numerical changes in the constituency as a whole to the nation level?
I'll address the last question if there's any. Yeah, please.
Sir, as you have been working with the politicians and all this, I wanted to ask why they are running away from RTI and not political parties.
The question was why are political parties not? Why don't political parties like the RTI? Them to be covered under the RTI. On your first question on PRS, essentially the idea was to provide research support to MPs on their lawmaking requirements. That was the primary sort of definition of PRS. We've got a LAM fellowship that provides some support for them to provide some of the staff support that they should have as a pilot. But that's very, very sort of in a nutshell what PRS does. Again, that's a longer story if I need to get into the details. On this question of, it's sort of a political economy question, but also a lot of the work that the MPs promise, they don't have direct authority over, but they have some influence by virtue of being an elected official, which they in some cases use to good effect. They will have an undue sort of power in persuading the district magistrate, for example, to allocate something here as opposed to there, right? So those are things that are not formal authority related, but it's influence versus authority, right? They don't have formal authority, but they have influence. That's how they negotiate a lot of what they do. And they also have many other sort of ways in which they reach out and sort of get stuff done, which is, I give you this, I take this from there, right? So, I mean, it's very hard to explain this in a sort of 1 minute response, but that is how a lot of MPs operate. Although they know they don't have the formal authority when they promise so many things, their hope is they will use that influence to get some of this done. For example, when they come to Delhi, a lot of the MPs have, detailed lists of petitions. They, for example, MPs go and sit in the railway ministry to get stuff done. What do? They go meet the railway minister and say, "Sir, हमारे लिए ये करा दीजिए. हमारे कॉन्स्टिट्यूंसी वाले मांग रहे हैं, हमारे लिए करा दीजिए." Right? And the negotiation could be that the government is trying to pass a bill somewhere, and it's trying to get the support of MPs, and they're asking for something legitimate. Nothing illegitimate in this, right? So getting a platform in a constituency, nothing illegitimate about it. The government might say, look, we could give these 4 things for MPs and get their support on some important legislation. That's entirely legitimate in a democracy. That's the negotiation. Have you heard of earmarks in the US legislation that we have? So, there is much more direct. They'd say, give this to my constituency, put it in this bill, only then will I sign that bill. They actually say it. So, democratic negotiation is sort of happening all the time in getting stuff done. That's really how things happen. That is not the role. That's why that is an expectation from the people, and I'm not saying they shouldn't do it, but the formal role of an MP is not that. Now, they must, of course, respond to the constituency needs. If they don't respond to the constituency needs, they will not get re-elected. So they have to find a way to do it. But is it part of what they're supposed to do? By and large, in a Westminster democracy, no. But they have to do it. Therefore, MPs have constituency offices. They have staff running around in some cases if they have the money to hire staff and get stuff done. But the constitutional sort of mandate is representation, not execution. If the people have a problem, you represent it in parliament and whatever other body you can, but execution is not your responsibility. It's a very it's a nuanced debate. I mean, you can get into this a lot of detail. On this question of RTI for political parties, certainly nobody wants to, give away the information, because a lot of the, I don't know if you look at the data that ADR has put out, that most political parties, even the large political parties, get only about 15-20% of money through checks. The rest of it, 80-85% comes in cash. And if you even dig deeper, where is this money from checks coming in, you might have many stories that might come out of all of that. So they just don't want to be. But there's another point which may be somewhat counterintuitive, which is, I believe political parties may not be mandated to be part of Right to Information Act. Now, if you look at the argument, they're drawing public subsidies, and therefore they should be part of the Right to Information regime. I get a gas cylinder in my house, that's subsidized. If I have a diesel car, diesel is subsidized. So the subsidy as a proxy for therefore Right to Information doesn't actually work. So this judgment as to whether political parties should be part of the Right to Information Act, ambit, is a somewhat difficult question. It's not a straightforward question. It's not moral ground. It's not, I'm moral, you're immoral question. It's much more nuanced than that. So it's a complicated one. That's what they will, in fact, if you look at the arguments of political parties are making, they're not saying we don't want to be in a direct way. They will say, look, these are the reasons why we think we should not be, and some of the reasons are definitely correct, in principle, right? So that's the point. That's what I said. For example, if the argument is, if the Central Information Commission argument is that you are under the Right to Information Act because you get state subsidy, right? You don't pay taxes on political party funds, then so am I as an individual. I get subsidies too. You get subsidies too, whether you know it or not. So are you under RTI? Do you have to disclose all of your personal stuff? No. Similarly, there are entities that draw, or NGOs, for example, they get public subsidies through tax, non-payment of taxes. Are they subject to RTI? It opens up a whole sort of debate that's much larger than just political parties. So it's the principle you'll have to sort of stick to. And on principle, they may have a point that's worth considering. I will actually stop here, Chandan. Okay, fine. I can take a couple more questions there. Why are they not accountable? They should be, right? So why do you think they're not accountable? In fact, the job of the politician is a job that has the greatest accountability attached to it. Because if he or she doesn't perform in your view, he's losing his job in 5 years. Which other job in the country has that kind of accountability attached to it? Does a bureaucrat lose his job? Does a policeman lose his job? Does a judge lose his job? The job of the politician actually is the most accountable by design. Now, is that the only form of accountability we want? Certainly not. We want different kinds of accountability, but we haven't put in place the systems through which we can ensure that accountability when the guy is in office. The 5 years is a long time. I've elected, 5 years later I'll throw him out, but that's a costly way of actually ensuring accountability. So, again, it brings me back to the point that if our public institutions have failed in different ways, then it's up to all of us to pick up the pieces and say, oh my God, what do we do to build those structures and institutions and mechanisms by which we can hold them to account. But for all of that, we need to be informed. We need to put in the time to understand these things, which for whatever reason we don't.
I would like to add a question. Seen in RTI, right? When lots of people have protested on RTI, but still it doesn't come up in the parliament. They didn't pass the bill. What was the reason for that?
When you say RTI or Lokpal?
No, I'm sorry, Lokpal. Lokpal.
The Lokpal debate is again is something that you've seen on television playing out. Clearly there are interests within the political structure that don't want Lokpal, right? Otherwise it would have passed many years ago. And it's not about this parliament. This is something that's been going for since the 1960s. Government after government has been trying to say we want Lokpal, but somehow the parliament doesn't pass. Now it's interesting to see that on some issues like the Lokpal, the government says we need consensus, right? And on some things, there is immediate consensus. Overnight, there is consensus. So that is how politics works. And that's why we need to be more and more vigilant, not less vigilant about what goes through, what doesn't go through. And so the onus actually in some ways comes back to us, right? About who we elect and how do we hold them to account for the kinds of things we want them to do. Do you have questions? ADR actually puts out this data on a regular basis. I don't know if you know about ADR and their fantastic work. The Association for Democratic Reforms has been around for about a dozen years now, and every election they put out data on how many MPs and MLAs have criminal records. According to their numbers, something like 28% of MPs have some criminal record or the other. But if you break it down, some of it has to do with going against Section 144. You know what Section 144 is? Yeah. So the government says it's prohibitory orders that you can't have an public assembly of more than 5 people in a place. And if the MP or MLA is trying to protest on some issue, right, then obviously they've assembled as a group. So you violated the Indian Penal Code, and therefore you can actually it's a criminal charge to actually have violated that code. So it's a criminal case. Now, is that Is it something that the MP is worried about or should be bothered about? The MP probably says, look, I don't care. In fact, in one of the instances I read in the newspaper somewhere that Lalu Prasad once said, अगर हमारे लोगों को क्रिमिनल केस नहीं है तो मैं उनको टिकट कैसे दूंगा? And listen to the logic. His point was, इसका मतलब है कि लोगों के लिए उन्होंने लड़ाई किया ही नहीं है. He has never fought for the people. In some ways he is right, right? If you look at the history of the independence movement, it's all about breaking the law, right? So if you want to fight for the people, you might have broken the law at some point. That's a point of view. You might not agree with it, but that's a point of view, right? Different point of view. Oh, absolutely. There are rapes and murder charges pending against MPs as well. That's about 6 or 7% as far as if I remember right. And certainly, there's no room for anybody with any sort of criminal record in Parliament. Again, if you talk to political parties, they have a whole different logic as to why they put those people up and why people elect those people. That's a bigger question, right? Why do people elect those people, right? So, without any justification, certainly we don't want any of those people. Let me make that absolutely clear. But again, if you look at the Supreme Court verdict that came about 2 months ago, it clearly said if there's a conviction, you have to stay out of Parliament. Yesterday the cabinet cleared something where they're going to say, it's okay. Now, these are the people we elected, so can we hold them to account to say no? How do we do that? We don't have the mechanism to do it. So it's a big challenge for us. It's if we think that, our democracy is somewhat broken, it certainly is. But, I can only take sort of some comfort in the fact that the UK has had an 800-year history of democracy and the US has a 400-year history of democracy. And so we'll evolve too. So I'm not saying, therefore, as an excuse for all that's broken. There's a lot of things we need to fix and fix them now. But it is a work in progress. It is a work in progress. I have one question.
Slightly different question. When you're talking about evaluating MPs, assessing what their performance is, some very superficial indicators could be attendance, participation in debates, questions asked. But I don't think they do real justice. So, since we talk about MPs, their prime function to be involved in policy making and making legislations and stuff, how do we evaluate, how do we assess the impact of one particular MP in coming up with one particular amendment or one particular intervention, inserting certain clauses in a certain policy? Those are the,
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very important point you make. Yeah, I'm certainly happy to answer that. Again, it goes to the kind of system we have. In India, most of the bills pass by voice vote, right? So the speaker says, all those in favor say aye, and the loud voice is aye, and all those in favor say no, the feeble voice that says no, and then the ayes have it, and the bill is passed, right? The problem is, we don't have a record of whether my MP was there when my bill was being passed, right? We don't have a record as to which way my MP voted on the bill. We haven't moved, we don't have a record of if anybody moved amendments, what the amendments were and who moved those amendments, right? Now, it's work in progress, unfortunately. In the US, for example, you can clearly say this MP, this congressman voted on this bill in so-and-so way, this particular amendment he moved is destroying jobs in the constituency or in the region, therefore we vote him out. In India, it's free for all. Free for all. Nobody knows what anybody is doing. It's convenient for every MP, right? He doesn't have to be accountable for anything. So actually there's a lot of institutional questions that are so central to how our democracy actually functions. And unfortunately they're very detail oriented, and you can't get mass support to argue for I want voted records on every bill in Parliament. There's no mass support for something like it. It will never happen. Therefore, it has to be some wise guy at some point or some bunch of MPs at some point coming and saying, we really need to make this happen. But that's a bit of a hit and miss.
But you have an idea as to what kinds of data we would require to
Oh,
get to that kind of, what kind of
It's very easy. I don't have to invent it. If you look at the US system, it's very easy. It's all out there. We just need to plug and play, and with some minor modification to suit our system. If you actually take that, we actually have pretty much all the answers you want, but we refuse to do it. We have a last question, sir.
RTI question, I don't have a question but a comment to make, because in public memory, there is an incident that has happened that needs to be registered. Constitutional Audit Agency wanted to audit how RTI has been implemented,
Yeah.
and how successfully CIC has done its work. And the Central Information Commissioner there was Raja Habibullah, who has gone on record saying CAG cannot audit me. And so that surprises me as much as it surprises me that political party says, no, we don't want to give out information, when it was the information about Habibullah doing his work.
It is.
No, constitutional audit also cannot touch me.
It actually goes to something that's very fundamental to our system, and actually just yesterday, Pratap Bhanu Mehta has written a beautiful piece in the Indian Express. If you haven't read it, please do. It's about how we think about accountability in our system, and how we, the elites in different roles, are actually breaking that accountability mechanism that we have and worsening it rather than actually improving upon it. So it actually goes down to that. If you look at Supreme Court coming under RTI, right? Supreme Court doesn't want to come under RTI. So the verdict, one bench said, oh, we should allow the RTI to be applied to Supreme Court. Then the matter was referred to the High Court of Delhi to say, oh, can we review that decision? So it's just bizarre how our institutions, the eminent Supreme Court that we have, or the, morally high ground, sort of, pedestal that the CIC stands on, or all of these institutions that we would like to believe are the epitomes of, all our moral values, somehow tend to want to evade any accountability of their own work. And that's at the heart of a lot of the discussion that we need to sort of break down. And this is just one piece, one small sliver of what we need to do. And that's also a challenge, obviously, for all of us, but also the big opportunity for institutions like the Azim Premji University to take up and say, look, I have the intellectual capability, I have the moral purpose that's guiding me, and the resources and the intellect to actually go ahead and do it. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed being here.